I participated in this event at the Harvard Business School where a bunch of business school professors were trying to figure out how to rescue the humanities because clearly the humanists are incapable of doing that. And the center of that discussion and the great example was the Jaipur Literary Festival. And as Willie just mentioned, I was so inspired by the Jaipur Literary Festival when I first went there 5 years ago, just in the middle of writing this book, which essentially tells the story of literature from the invention of writing to the present, that I was trying to figure out how should I end this story? Where should this story of literature, the 4,000 years of literature, end? And I decided, of course, it has to end at the Jaipur Literary Festival. That's where world literature happens today. And so basically what I realized I was doing was telling the prehistory of the Jaipur Literary Festival. So I want to give you a little bit of a taste of the prehistory of the Jaipur Literary Festival, which, and all stories should start at the beginning, starts with the invention of writing. Of course, storytelling, it predates writing. Humans have told stories about themselves, about others, about the world, to make sense of the world wherever they have existed. But at some point, that storytelling tradition intersected with writing. And that happened in Mesopotamia, in today's Iraq. Now, we don't know, of course, how the invention of writing really happened. It's always difficult to point to a moment of origin. The wonderful story of the diamond we just heard is, I think, a good example of that. But there is a story Mesopotamian scribes told about the invention of writing, a story that's itself over 3,000 years old, that I think gives us an inkling of how this happened. And the story is set in the city of Uruk in today's Iraq, really one of the first urban spaces in history made possible by a new form of intensive agriculture. So the king of Uruk, king of this growing and important state, has his eyes set, in fact, on the metals and minerals of the mountain state of Arata. So what he does, he sends a messenger to the mountain state of Arata and threatens the ruler of Arata and demands allegiance. The ruler of Arata is not very impressed by these threats. He sends the messenger back with a challenge. The king of Uruk meets the challenge, and still the king of Arata won't give in. And all the while, the messenger is running back and forth between the city of Uruk, which is in the floodplains between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, and that mountain realm. And both kings get angrier and angrier. And at some point, the king of Uruk is so enraged that he launches into this long rant. And the messenger standing next to him panics because he can't remember the long rant. And it's at this point in the story about the origin of writing that the story says that the king of Uruk took some clay from the ground, flattened the clay into a tablet, put his words onto the tablet. This is a cuneiform tablet with an envelope, gave it to the messenger. The messenger runs one more time up into the mountain, gives this message to the king of Arata. The king of Arata takes this clay tablet, holds it to his ear. There's no word coming from it, and then is somehow so impressed by this technology that he pledges his allegiance to Uruk. Now, there are two things that are interesting about the story of the origin. One is that it's clearly a story about the power of writing. One way of describing this story, that this was the first text message sent in the history of the world by one angry ruler to another. There are no resonances with today, I don't think. And so it's clear these scribes have perhaps an inflated sense of the importance of this technology over which they preside. The other thing that's interesting about the story is that it has actually nothing to do with literature. It's a story about a kind of diplomatic or undiplomatic text message. It's a story about imperial power. And that's, in fact, the use of writing in Mesopotamia for hundreds of years. Writing was used to write down economic transactions, was used to build a kind of first state bureaucracy for these growing city-states. But it had nothing to do with that other activity of storytelling. So in a sense, writing was really invented by accountants, you could say. But at some point, one of these imperial accountants used this, what's essentially an accounting technology, for a completely different purpose, and that is to write down a story. And that, for me, is sort of the big bang of literature. That's when storytelling and writing technologies intersect. And that's when literature, as I understand it, namely important written stories, begins. And because that's how I start, and that's what I see sort of as the definition of literature, the intersection of storytelling and writing technologies, the subsequent story I tell is one that combines these two things, different forms of storytelling that have evolved since then in connection to different forms of writing technologies. And so the first great text of world literature that emerges from this intersection comes indeed from Mesopotamia, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's one of the 12 tablets on which this epic is written. And what's interesting to me about it is how proud this epic is of two things. First, of the city of Uruk, where that story about the invention of writing I just mentioned takes place. King Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and is seen as one of its great kings. The other is how proud the epic is of writing. It presents itself as being written down. King Gilgamesh is celebrated as a writer king, and it is very clearly very proud of this achievement of Mesopotamian civilization, namely writing. And that's very different from other ancient epics, especially and including the Homeric epics, which present themselves as being sung orally. And in fact, in the entirety of the Iliad and the Odyssey, there is, with one small exception, no reference to writing. The world of Homer is a pre-literate world, and it presents itself as being sung rather than written. The much older Epic of Gilgamesh is different. It knows it's written, it celebrates the written world, and it celebrates the technology of writing, which is incisions on clay. And I think one reason is that this entire marvel of civilization, the city of Uruk, is really a marvel made out of clay. King Gilgamesh is celebrated in the epic as the builder or rebuilder of the city's wall, which is made out of clay bricks, and the entire city is made of clay. There's mention even of the clay pits that are part of the city of Uruk, the place from which this material is harvested. But the most celebrated, the most important use of this material is, of course, this, namely the clay tablets on which this first written writing-based civilization emerges. So that's, in a sense, the first stage of literature, the first intersection of storytelling and writing technologies. And as writing itself spreads to other parts of the world, similar things happen, that you have these oral stories that enter the world of writing. You have scribes that are trained in this still very difficult craft of writing, and the result is what I call these foundational texts, texts that become reference points for entire regions and entire civilizations. Fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh were found all over the Near East, and it's very clear that, in a sense, what happens to that first text message from the king of Uruk, sent to a rival who is being subdued, happens to the Epic of Gilgamesh, that this text was being exported to this, what was really the first territorial state in the history of human civilization. And that lets me appreciate the importance, maybe we would call it soft power, of these written stories. I want to move on to perhaps a second stage or second chapter in the story of literature, and that's sort of a twist on these foundational texts that happen when oral storytelling intersects with writing technology. That scene, or that episode, is situated not all that far from the city of Uruk. It takes place in Babylon, and it is set amongst a group of Jerusalem exiles that are driven from Jerusalem, which has been destroyed, into Babylonian exile. And very interesting things happen to these Jewish exiles in Babylon. They no longer have access to their temple, so Judaism becomes a portable religion that can be practiced in exile. And the way this happens is that the written stories of the Jews become increasingly important and elaborate, because the exiled Jews in Babylon are now part of the most elaborate writing civilization still on earth. And some exiles, like for example the scribe Ezra, become Babylonian scribes, and they add to the store of written texts. And then when Ezra is allowed to gather a group of exiled Jews and return to Jerusalem, he brings with him these much more elaborate stories. They return to Jerusalem, they rebuilt the city wall, they rebuilt the temple. They are now able to reinstitute Judaism as a temple practice, a practice that takes place in one place, namely in Jerusalem. But in addition, Ezra brings that Babylonian writing culture with him. And this is when this scene that for me encapsulates the next stage in the history of storytelling happens. And Ezra plans this very carefully. He constructs a wooden stage, much like this one. He gathers everybody around. He steps onto this wooden stage, and he holds up the Torah scrolls that he has brought with him from Babylon. And he demands that the assembled people worship these scrolls as if they were a god. And that, for me, is the moment when the idea of sacred writing is invented, where we don't just have foundational stories that may deal with gods and the relationships between humans and gods, but when this technology, this new writing technology itself, becomes an object of worship. It's a very familiar concept to us. I think today it's very difficult to imagine a form of religion that's not based on sacred writing. So it's a very familiar concept, but like all things, this idea had to be invented several times. And one of the places where I think it was invented was in that scene when Ezra holds up the Torah scrolls and demands obedience and allegiance to this text, to text being written down. This is a medieval a depiction of Ezra. Of course, at that time, it was the form of scroll, not as these medieval Christian monks imagined a medieval study with books. It looks more like this, one of the oldest existing Torah scrolls that was by accident discovered in the University of Bologna. So foundational texts, and some foundational texts now get turned into sacred writing. And as I mentioned, I think this is another idea from the deep history of writing that's still very much with us. All world religions really are based on writing, and we've since exported this idea of sacred texts to other foundational texts, like, say, the Declaration of Independence, with all the problems this brings with it, what I call textual foundationalism or textual fundamentalism, an insistence on a particular reading of these foundational texts, problems both in religious and political texts. I want to rush on to the next stage in the story of literature, and that stage takes place in a couple of different places and in a very different kind of scene from the one we just encountered, where a scroll, where text is being held up for worship. This stage revolves around teachers. Teachers that live in different parts of the world, and in fact in some of the most writing-based cultures of the world. These teachers have introduced a new way of teaching and talking, not just new modes of thought, but different ways of interacting with their followers and students that demand that these students not just adopt new ways of thinking about the world, but also new ways of living. They're addressing their students and demanding of their students that they really change their lives. And this, these students do in increasing numbers. This is a picture of the first of these master teachers, the Buddha, surrounded by some of his students. This is a depiction of another such master teacher, Confucius, surrounded by his favorite students. This is, of course, David's depiction of Socrates at the moment of his death, surrounded by his students and followers. And this is a depiction of Jesus with his followers. Now, some people have called this the Axial Age, the moment when in different cultures these master teachers, as they're called in China, emerge and have this transformative effect on their students. What interests me about them is really two things. The first is that they emerge in some of the most writing-intensive, most scriptural societies on Earth, with the possible exception of South Asia. The other thing is that none of these four teachers write a single word. They live in these writing-based cultures. They could have written, but they choose not to. Instead, they really depend on that live interaction with their students and followers. We don't know exactly why they chose not to write, with the exception of Socrates, who makes very elaborate arguments against this newfangled technology. He argues, among other things, that a written communication can very easily be taken out of context. It can lead to all kinds of misunderstandings because you can't ask a text follow-up questions. So there's all kinds of danger of losing control over speech. And he also worries that written texts are sort of external memory devices on which we rely and threaten to lose our own capacity of thought, even that we sort of externalize thought and knowledge. In any case, this is what these four teachers have in common. They refuse to write. They insist on that live interaction, and that goes really well. Until at some point, inevitably, these teachers die. And now the students are faced with a very interesting dilemma. What should they do? They begin these oral traditions, remembering the words of their teachers, but sooner or later, the temptation is too great, and these students start to write down their teacher's words. In a sense, they do exactly what their teacher had told them not to do. And as a teacher myself, I can say that, of course, this is what all good students do. They do exactly what you tell them not to do. The other interesting thing about these students who, in a sense, betray their teachers' ruling against writing is that they really know very well what they're doing. They know that their teacher's power had resided on this live interaction. So what they do, they produce texts that read very differently from these older scriptural texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Hebrew Bible, because these texts these students produce, the Socratic dialogues, the Analects of Confucius, the Buddhist sutras, they are much more vivid, they are dialogic, they show their teachers in live interaction with their students, and they channel that sort of live speech, that insistence on dialogue back into writing and produce a new type of text that revolves around the actions and words of these students. I want to take 2 more minutes to follow the fortunes of one of these texts, namely the Diamond Sutra, which is written down in India, transported to China, and it's in China where the Diamond Sutra encounters two technologies that will determine the fate of the written world. One is paper, and the other is print. As you may know, in this audience, the oldest surviving printed text in the world is a version of the Diamond Sutra from 868, so hundreds of years before Gutenberg will reinvent print in Northern Europe. And it shows that some of these foundational texts that I've been talking about become early adopters of new writing technologies. And in fact, that's a pattern that will happen throughout the history of writing. The first text that Gutenberg will print with his reinvented printing press is the Latin Bible. So that's one of the patterns I see from this bird's eye view of literature. The foundational texts are often in the best position to use these new technologies. They're most invested in using them and become early adopters, as I said. But the other thing that happens with these new technologies, paper, print, is that they lower the cost of literature. And as always, when you lower the cost of something, transformative effects happen, including ticket entrance prices to the Jaipur Festival. And that is that there's a popular explosion of writing, and that happens in China with the introduction of paper and print, and it will happen again in Northern Europe. The rest of the story of literature is something that you probably know much better, because we are moving here to our present moment. And apart from being a prehistory of the Jaipur Literary Festival, this is also a prehistory of our current technological transformation of writing that is changing how stories are told, how they're read, how they're distributed, and also what kind of stories make it into writing that's happening all around us. These transformations are real and palpable. What I'm struck by is that there are also very interesting returns. I began with the clay tablet and the invention of writing. Tablets fell out of use for thousands of years. Now, of course, they are being used again. And when I see my students sitting on the floor, cross-legged with their tablets on their laps, they look just like depictions of Egyptian or Mesopotamian scribes. The other old technology is the scroll. We are, for the first time, the book had replaced the scroll as the most sort of efficient way of recording writing, but we are now scrolling down our computer screens again. And so it's interesting how, as with all revolutions, there's a kind of interesting combination of old and new. So I think I should stop here with this overview of the written world, this combination of storytelling and writing technology, and invite you to ask questions or engage in a quick dialogue. Thank you very much. Questions? And it's a little hard to see you. If there are questions, yes, in the middle.
So just curious, in terms of the foundational text and the starting of the written word across different languages,
yes.
Was it still kind of the same, or was it different, like certain languages lend themselves more to the written word?
I don't think, it's an interesting question. There's an interesting story to be told about different writing systems in different languages, but I think the real difference isn't so much the language itself. It's really more how that original moment begins. And an interesting comparison is, for example, the Chinese literary tradition versus, let's say, India or Greece or Mesopotamia. I mostly talked about literary traditions that begin, whose early foundational texts are essentially narrative texts, epic texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Indian epics or the Homeric epics. What's interesting about the Chinese literary tradition is that the foundational text is a poetry anthology, a poetry collection, and I think that makes a huge difference for the subsequent history of Chinese literature, the importance of poetry that's instituted right at the center of this literary tradition. That even means that when in poetry gets included in novels, when newer forms of literature emerge, poetry gets enshrined into imperial examination system. So it really changes the entire, the different point of origin, I think, that different genre at the origin of that tradition really changes the subsequent course of that great literary tradition. So I think, in a sense, if I look for differences, I would rather look there, the kinds of types of literature that begin a literary tradition, rather than the specific language in which it is written down, although that also makes, of course, some difference. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
It may sound very innate, but I'm just wondering, sort of being a little blank, to be able to put things down in writing, there has to be alphabet or symbols. So to go from the oral to the written tradition, where's that link?
So all the early writing systems, and it's a fascinating transition, and the story with which I begin is sort of an attempt to try to figure out in what situation would writing begin. So all the early writing systems are not alphabetic writing system. Cuneiforms, Egyptian writings, Chinese writing, none of them, they're all logographic. That is, that ideas or concepts or things are being represented in some way. And then the way writing systems mostly develop is that then some of these signs start to do double duty. They still stand for the concept of or idea or object that's being represented, and they start to stand also for the sound combination that's sort of crucially at that term. And that's when you get so-called syllabaries. And then and out of that, then later emerge alphabets. Once alphabets emerge, their ease basically wipes out most other writing systems, not all, East Asia being the great and fascinating exception to this rule. So yes, once the alphabet emerges, it takes over almost everywhere, but not entirely everywhere. Yeah. Who has the mic? I think there's a microphone.
Yes, hi. This may sound like a peculiar question, but to what extent do you think maybe the written word is not as important, shall we say? I'm really struck by the growth of podcasts, of the amazing growth of the company Audible, where people want to listen rather than read.
Right.
I'm curious to know your reaction to all of that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And when I began this book, I thought, okay, at the beginning of these different writing traditions, of course, oral storytelling is, as I mentioned, it's going to be crucial how it gets transformed into writing. What I didn't quite anticipate, what I came very quickly to appreciate, is precisely what you mentioned, namely that the continuing oral storytelling tradition in the history of writing. One of the late chapters in my book is the great West African Epic of Sunjata that existed for hundreds of years, but was only written down actually in the late 20th century. So oral storytelling has always coexisted with different writing forms, and the technological changes that you just mentioned with Audible is just another version of it. So it's not so much writing replaces oral storytelling, but it adopts it, it draws on it, it changes it, but oral storytelling continues, and really one has to kind of think of them almost as part of the same system that gets reconfigured with each new technological moment. And I think that's exactly what's happening right now with the changes that you mentioned. Last question. Yes, sir, right in the middle.
When does writing come to India?
Yeah, that's an incredibly heated and, I dare say, ideological question. So I've generally been very lucky with reviews and the readers' comments of this book. The most rabid attack came from someone who was very invested in the fact that the so-called Indus Valley script is a full writing system, and the kind of idea of the prestige of having one of the oldest writing systems. So it's unclear. So there is the so-called Indus Valley script. It's so far the consensus is that it's probably not a full, it's certainly symbolic, a written sign system, but it's not a system that represents language in its entirety. It's possible that more examples and a wider variety of symbols of the so-called Indus Valley script will be discovered, so you never know. But right now, the best guess is that it comes actually much later, and that all the great, as you probably know better than I, all the great South Asian epics existed for a long time as oral stories and get written down quite late. And it's very interesting that even the scholarly literature of these epics, I think always, even when they talk about these early versions of these epics that can have only been really oral, they talk about texts, they talk about sometimes oral literature. I found the scholarship on early South Asian writing the most obfuscating in some ways, the most heated, out of, I think, a misguided idea that the earlier, the earlier you can date your own writing system, the more prestigious. So it's a fascinating, I'm not an expert in this field, but it was a fascinating part of the research. And I think it showed how much sense of prestige and so forth is connected to this idea of writing, where I think India is a fascinating cultural sphere that shows how very long oral traditions determine this culture. The same with print. Print came very, very late to India, brought via Europe by the Portuguese. So in a sense, if I may end with this broad cultural difference, that China pioneers these two really transformative technologies, paper and print, and becomes a print-based literary tradition much before India. So both writing and these later print technologies come to India later, but you could almost say that perhaps because of that, there is this unbelievable epic in storytelling tradition in India. So it's a good question, and was a real revelation for me in researching this. Thank you.